Hey Lake Point, Pastor Mike here to get you caught up on the fourth week of our series, Made for More. A series in which we're doing a deep dive into the life of a man named Joseph. Joseph overcame a lot of adversity early in life, and he grew to a position of influence and authority, resulting in him being able to save the lives of thousands of people, if not millions. However, in order to do so, there was a number of character tests he had to pass along the way. And we believe that, like Joseph, you were made for more, and that if you too pass the character test that God puts in front of you, your life can have a greater influence and a lasting impact. This week, Pastor Roy shared about the purity test. Now, failing the purity test has been the downfall of many public figures, politicians, teachers, movie stars, and even many high-profile and even low-profile pastors and clergy. There's often a feeling of what could have been, and depending on the severity of the sexual sin, many are never trusted to rebuild the status and position they once had. And so Roy picked up the story of Joseph in Genesis 39. At this point, Joseph had been sold as a slave to a man named Potiphar, and it doesn't take long for Joseph's hard work and his character to earn him his trust and get him placed in charge of Potiphar's entire household. And so for 11 years, Joseph works for Potiphar, and everything's going smoothly until things take a dramatic turn starting in verse 6, and it reads this, that Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come and sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, "my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." However, she kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept her out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, when no one else was around, he went in to do his work, and so she grabbed him by the cloak, demanding, "Come on, sleep with me." And Joseph tore himself away, but he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. And when she saw that she was holding his cloak and he had fled, she called out to her servants, and soon all the men came running. "Look," she said, "my husband has brought this Hebrew slave here to make fools of us. He came into my room to rape me, but I screamed. And when he heard me scream, he ran outside and he got away, but he left his cloak with me." She kept the cloak with her until her husband came home. Then she told him the story, and that Hebrew slave you've bought, came into our house and tried to come around and fool around with me. And she said, "But when I screamed, he ran outside leaving his cloak." And Potiphar was furious when he heard his wife's story and how Joseph had treated her. And so he took Joseph and he threw him into the prison where the king's prisoners were held, and there he remained. Joseph passed the purity test. We saw that in the story, but it ends with him in a bad spot. Now, if you know the story though, the prison is what actually sets him up for the biggest promotion of his life. But the question Roy looked at is, how can we learn from Joseph when we're tempted to compromise our purity? So here's 5 things that Roy shared. First, take responsibility. When Joseph is tempted, he states, "How then could I do such a wicked thing?" Often when we're confronted with our sins, we often make excuses of why we couldn't help ourselves. Joseph doesn't do that. He recognizes temptation, and he recognizes what he has control over, himself. Now, keep in mind, up to this point, Joseph's life has been a disappointment compared to what he thought it would be. And the reality is, often disappointment leads to disobedience. We often feel that if God's not holding up his end of the bargain, why should we? We see this in marriages. We justify affairs or improper behavior because maybe the marriage is disappointing, or maybe it's not what you thought it would be, or maybe it seems like it's just lacking love. And then a coworker flirts, or an old girlfriend sends you a Facebook message, and instead of stopping it in its tracks, you actually entertain it. And then you rationalize that the disappointment of my relationship justifies my disobedience to the relationship. And so you shift the responsibility off of you. But Joseph doesn't do that. Joseph knows that the momentary pleasure is not worth the long-term damage it will do. The second thing that Joseph does is he recognizes it as a sin. He knows that if he gives into the advances of Potiphar's wife, he will be committed wrongdoing against Potiphar, and more importantly, against God. He can rationalize it all he wants, that she came on to me, I'm just a slave, what was I to do, and no one will ever find out. But the truth is, it's a sin, and so he doesn't try to sugarcoat it. Each of us needs to pre-decide how we're going to respond before that moment of temptation comes. Joseph must have noticed Potiphar's wife admiring him, and so when he rejects her advances, Joseph likely has predetermined his response in case she tried something. The third thing Roy shared that Joseph did was to trust God's voice, or said another way, to live with conviction. And conviction comes from knowing the heart of God and understanding what he wants is best for you. When you understand the heart of God, you understand He's not trying to restrict you, He's trying to offer you more than a temporary thrill that life can offer. Joseph understood, as hard as it was, that God wanted more for him, that he was made for more, and the only way to reach that destiny that God has for him was to maintain his purity at all costs. The fourth way that Joseph maintained his purity was he refused to linger. In verse 10, we see that Joseph doesn't just refuse to sleep with Potiphar's wife, he refused to be around her. He understood that although he may have resisted the temptation once, the flesh can be weak. So the wise thing for him to do was to stay clear of danger. When it comes to purity, we often believe that the warning signs are just that, warnings, and that we know better. We can get closer to the edge without going over. When it comes to sexual sin, as soon as you see the warning signs though, you need to turn around. Like Joseph, you need to refuse to linger. And finally, Roy shared that one of the things we can learn from Joseph's purity test is that we need to run. When Potiphar's wife insisted and forced herself upon him, he got out of there fast. In fact, he left her holding his robe, which is interesting because at the beginning, we see a change in character for Joseph, right? He goes from a young, arrogant 17-year-old whose coat means more to him than his humility and his character. And now as a young adult man, his humility and character mean more to him than his silly coat. God's clearly doing something in his life. In 1 Corinthians 6:18, Paul affirms Joseph's strategy. He writes this, he says, "Run from sexual sin. No other sin so clearly affects the body as this one does, for sexual immorality is a sin against your own body." Notice he doesn't say slowly step away or stick around, see if it's as bad as you thought. He says run, turn fully away, and don't look back. Well, friends, thanks for listening. Enjoy jumping into discussion questions. I'll see you next time, and remember, you were made for more.